thank you to the ES team for having me here today. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I see the majority of people are in Europe, so good evening. My name is Yayoi Sekine. As Zach said, I head the decentralized energy practice here at Bloomberg NEF. And today I'll talk a little bit about our outlook on energy storage and really looking beyond COVID-19. I think that we've been hearing and talking a lot about COVID-19, but the market fundamentals are strong beyond it. And that will really be the focus today and looking, I guess Europe is a great market, but there's a lot going on elsewhere as well. So I'll talk to that as well. For those of you who do not know who Bloomberg NEF or BNEF for short is, just a quick minute here to let you know what we do. So we actually help companies and countries navigate the energy transition. The scope of the energy transition has evolved quite a lot and expanded beyond what was, I guess, clean core to our coverage around clean power. And we really wanted to make sure that we were expanding our coverage beyond the entirety of the kind of covering the entirety of the energy transition in all key sectors. So this slide shows how we cover it from bottom to top or top to bottom and from left to right, from end to end. And our sector transitions cover clean power, transport, buildings, and industry and agriculture. And you'll see there on the right-hand side, cross-cutting technologies are key that could be key to help decarbonize and hard-to-abate sectors through technologies or technologies including hydrogen. And all of this is underpinned by data and analysis on the left-hand side. So if you think of commodities, that's really how we think about how markets are moving and how to quantify different pieces of the market. We usually sit across multiple offices in the world, which helps us get a global perspective on what's happening across the energy transition and beyond the energy transition. We're about 250 professionals. Today, we're mostly sitting at home in different places in the world, but we are quite spread out. But to the actual content for today, the focus today is to talk about the major factors driving energy storage, and I'll give some perspective on our outlook and in light of kind of these major factors. So I'll start off on the first factor, which is falling costs. I put duh because this is a story we all know. I really like this chart. I think many of you in the industry have already seen it multiple times, but it helps quantify just how quickly lithium-ion battery lithium-ion battery prices have fallen over the last 10 years. They've fallen about 87%. From over $1,000 per kilowatt hour to down to 156 back in 2019, and we're expecting a further 13% drop this year alone. And when we present this chart, it's kind of like these simple and sleek bars year across year. What they demonstrate is what we call volume weighted average, because it considers the volume, the function of prices as a function of volume across different segments. So if you think about electric vehicles, there's a lot more volumes and prices are lower. That factors in at a higher weight or a bigger weight compared to, say, stationary storage, where volumes are smaller. And I'll show some of the slides kind of quantifying these in just a bit. And these trends are expected to continue. So previous blue bars equates to the blue triangles in this chart. So historically, we've seen about an 18% learning rate. So what that means is every doubling cumulative capacity, we've seen about an 18% drop in prices historically, which is pretty impressive. That's a trend that we expect to continue. That's actually how we infer how prices will look like in the future, getting to a sub $100 per kilowatt hour battery prices by, I guess, 2024, so even before mid 2020s. And at about $100 per kilowatt hour, that's kind of where we see electric vehicles compete on an upfront basis against conventional cars or internal combustion engine cars. So that's really something that's happening in the next 5 years. It's an incredible pace of innovation that's happening to allow this to happen. At BNEF, we do quite a lot of research trying to validate if these costs are possible by doing bottom-up analysis on materials and manufacturing, and seeing where innovations might happen to kind of scale us to the next level. And by 2030, we reach $61 per kilowatt hour lithium-ion battery prices. And to talk to volumes, so I like to present this chart to keep us in perspective when we're thinking about stationary storage. So what you see here is lithium-ion battery demand annually by sector or by segment. So each one of the stacks represents a different segment. So passenger EVs in blue, stationary storage in pink, and what you see there is a lot of electric vehicle or transport related applications or demand sources for lithium-ion batteries. And stationary storage, I guess by in 2020, it represents actually just 5% of the kind of the total EV battery demand. So comparatively very small. By 2030, the share increases, so it represents about 11% or 10% of battery demand compared to electric vehicles. So it's still a small share. And I like to compare these two charts, the pricing one before and this one here, because it gives us perspective that a lot of the innovation is happening as a function of electric vehicles and manufacturing scale up that's resulting from that sector. It's obviously not always a like-to-like comparison. When we think of volume-weighted average prices, this is kind of what I'm talking about. So in this chart here, what you see is battery prices by segment, volume-weighted averages by segment. So again, pink stationary storage is at a premium to a lot of the electric vehicle segments on the left-hand side in red and green. So it's about 218 actually dollars per kilowatt hour, so higher than the 156 that I showed previously. And what you see is kind of the solid colors representing the cell prices, and the lighter color representing the pack prices for the different segments. And there's probably more to say about why it's more expensive than battery electric. PHEVs or plug-in hybrid batteries are typically smaller, higher powered, and tend to be more expensive on a volume basis compared to battery electric. And e-buses generally, we just have seen less scale compared to China and use different technologies or different chemistries compared to China. So there's quite a lot we could dissect here, but I think the key message is stationary storage is still a smaller segment compared to the total battery market or the total lithium-ion battery market, but it benefits from a lot of the scale that we see there. And I like this chart, which I pulled together yesterday, just to kind of get perspective on scale from the perspective of energy storage projects. So what you see here is basically two lines, the purple line representing the biggest energy storage project based on a megawatt basis each year being commissioned, or I guess in the future expected to be commissioned in 2021 and 2022. And the blue line representing the biggest megawatt hour projects being commissioned across the different years. And the trend is pretty clearly upwards and to the top, right, and upwards. And this matters from, well, not just from the perspective of the biggest project, but if you were to map out or chart out projects based on the average project size, it's a similar trend. So we've seen scale happening at the individual project level basis, and this is looking at utility scale projects and tracking probably more than 1,000 different projects in the world. And I like to think about scale because it helps us understand why innovation is happening, not just to reduce lithium-ion battery costs, but also to reduce costs related to integration and other non-battery costs in stationary storage systems. Tesla comes up a lot, I know, but it's a really useful example just to show how products have evolved quite rapidly. So the Power Pack, for example, was a standard Tesla product for utility scale projects. It had a capacity of 232 kilowatt hours, and we see them announcing the Mega Pack, which comes at a unit size of 3 megawatt hours. And the Mega Pack has 10 times faster installation, 40% less space, 10 times fewer parts, and it's targeted to the 1 gigawatt hour project sizes. So it's essentially looking at a very kind of a much larger scale project size. And this matters from the perspective of understanding how costs can further decline, and not just batteries, but non-battery costs as well, as you construct more efficient systems from cost and equipment perspective. And when we look at kind of the cost stack, so what you see here is energy storage system costs for a best in class, probably best thought of storage system. So you see there the blue part of that stack is the lithium-ion batteries in this case. It's actually it continues to be by 2030 the biggest part of the stack, but it's also where the biggest drop in costs across lithium-ion systems. That's kind of where the majority of the cost declines will happen. That said, we do see significant improvement, as shown in the previous slide, across the other aspects of the stack. So the balance of system, power conversion systems, inverters, and the energy management system. And this is just for an example of 20 megawatts for 80 megawatt hour storage system being placed in 2020 through to 2030. So in total, we see about a 50% or halving in costs from 2019 through to 2030, which is really impressive from the perspective of understanding where costs are going. So, okay, so costs are falling. We all know that. So how does that actually translate to how storage systems compete against incumbent generation or any generator in for that matter? So at Bloomberg NEF, what we do is we try to come up with some metrics of how to assess that. One of them that you see here is our levelized cost of electricity, which looks at essentially how different types of generators compete against each other. And what you see here in pink is battery storage, a 4-hour system, LCOE in the past, I guess, 8 years since we've been doing this, looking specifically at storage implied based on historical numbers, and the OCGT, so gas peaking plants globally, range. So how much it costs to build and generate electricity from a gas peaking plant across different markets on the high end in Japan and in the low end in the US. And what we see is by the first half of this year, based on our current system costs, actually batteries already compete against gas peakers on a cost basis. There are some assumptions that go into this math, but essentially what we're looking at is if batteries were to charge using electricity at 60% of the wholesale market prices for energy, you'd be able to compete against a gas peaker in these markets, which is an incredible feature. So factor number one, falling costs as a result of scale, helping storage compete against different types of generators. Moving on to factor number two is, well, flexibility needs are growing. I just love this map because what you see here is essentially what is the cheapest source of bulk electricity in the different markets of the world. In blue and yellow, you see wind and solar. In gray and black, you see gas and coal. I like it because it's incredibly blue and yellow, and what you see is essentially wind and solar being the cheapest source of new bulk electricity in many markets in the world. And in fact, it represents about 72% of the world's population, and about and sorry, 2/3 of the world population and 72% of global GDP. So this is incredible. I mean, every year there's another country where we're seeing becoming yellow or blue. And the reason why this matters is as we're adding more renewables and cheaper renewables become kind of the norm across different markets, that means that we have to think about how we're planning our system, and our system becomes more and more renewable, which means we need more flexibility to kind of manage the variability around renewables. And I'd like to give the example of California, not just because I sit in the US, but because there is great data to kind of look at, and a great example of how renewables has really transformed the power system in California. So what you see here is essentially the supply curve back in 2010, so not currently. We'll see how it changed over time. So essentially, each one of these lines vertically represents a different generator in California. And they're all stacked from left to right based on short-run marginal costs. So how much does it cost to operate the plant on a short-run basis? And so you'll see to the left a lot of dark blue representing hydro and a lot of purple representing gas. And I like to compare this with this because essentially what you see is from 2010 through to 2019, this curve basically gets pushed to the right. And what's pushing it to the right is essentially the yellow that you see in the beginning of that stack. So about 12 gigawatts of solar capacity that was virtually in existence back in 2010, becoming a significant portion of the stack in 2019. Um, and this is kind of cool just from that perspective, but to try to understand how it actually impacts the power system and power prices, this is probably quite kind of more useful to see the daily profile. This, what you see here is each one of these curves showing the daily profile between 2013, the average daily profile from 2013 through to 2018. And what you see is how generators basically come online during the course of the day. Purple again representing gas, and what you see is kind of that egg yolk growing over time or across the years as more solar gets added to the system. And I think what's most interesting is, yes, the yolk grows. Well, we also see the purple, so gas, needing to become more flexible as a result because they now have to turn off more often when solar is on and ramp up quickly when solar is ramping down. And that really shows on the blue lines in this chart. So the blue lines represent the power prices across the different times of day. So the average power prices across the different times of day across these different years. And what you see is, I guess you might already be familiar with this, but the concept of the duck curve. So this represents more or less the shape of a duck curve, which is to say there's an increasing ramp in the evening, which is kind of the neck of the duck, as gas generators need to ramp up and they're expensive to meet the solar ramp down during the day. And well, actually, it's more than just a duck. It's probably more like a Loch Ness monster by the time we get to 2018, because that ramp up is pretty high, or the price difference between the off peak to peak price is quite high and quite sharp. And so we probably have evolved to Loch Ness monster by this stage. And we think about arbitrage a lot from the perspective of batteries because that's potentially where you can make money. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is where you can make the most money out of an arbitrage opportunity across different markets. And I have a great team of people across BNEF, some analysts who actually tracked 56 different markets to see what is the price arbitrage on average using wholesale prices historically. And essentially, California actually ranks sixth across the top 10 markets, which is pretty important, a pretty impressive feature if you think how dramatic that curve is in California. And I think and on the right hand side, actually you see the bottom 10 markets. What you see on the left hand side in terms of the top 10 markets is that you actually don't see a lot of Europe there. You end up seeing a lot of the European markets on the right hand side. So we don't see the kind of volatility in power prices throughout the day as we do on average in a lot of other markets like Australia and markets in the US. And we think about arbitrage a lot, but I'm showing here an example of a battery being operated in California, which is a 4-hour battery. And from an arbitrage perspective, this is just showing revenues. It's like the US is great because there's some great data that we can pull to kind of start looking at the operational profile of storage systems and generators in general. But here what you see is how much this particular battery project has been earning across different revenues, be that energy or regulation. So regulation being a form of ancillary service. And actually the energy portion, so thinking about that energy arbitrage opportunity, only represents about a third of the revenues from this project between March 2017 and December 2019. And regulation represents about 2/3 of the market payments that this project is earning. So yes, arbitrage is interesting, but another important part of flexibility is have ancillary services to meet the volatility, to help manage the volatility of the system. And well, having talked about the sixth biggest market in terms of opportunities for arbitrage, we can probably jump into the first ranking one there, which is South Australia. And I like South Australia as an example because, well, we talk about Tesla again a lot, but this particular chart here shows the market revenues for the Hornsdale Power Reserve project in South Australia, which was a big Tesla project that was delivered in the record 100 days. And again, what we see here is actually an even more dramatic picture compared to the California one, which is the blue bar here representing the energy payments from from that particular project or given to that particular project. And every other part of this kind of the other colorful stacks represents other ancillary services in the Australian market. And what this shows is actually batteries can play very flexibly into multiple types of revenues and services. And it's probably one of the most flexible technologies from that standpoint. And that works to its advantage because it can try to kind of monetize across multiple revenue streams. I particularly like this chart because it's very colorful and it helps kind of to explain the message of why energy storage helps with helps in supporting flexibility needs of a more renewable system or a more volatile system. And well, moving on to point 3 of major factors driving energy storage, batteries are becoming of age in European markets. So I'm sure there's been a lot of conversation about this already. On the left-hand side, we see, for example, only this year, in France, RT, the French transmission system operators, announced that batteries won the majority of the capacity in the auction. Demand response taking a share of that. And this auction was specifically targeted to low carbon or zero emission technologies. But it was also the first time that storage won capacity contracts in France. So it was about 253 or so megawatts of capacity that cleared the market. And storage has been participating in other markets or other capacity market mechanisms as well. So on the right-hand side, you see there new build capacity clearing the UK capacity auctions over the last 4 auctions. There's about 1.6 or so gigawatts of capacity that has cleared the UK capacity market over the last 4 capacity auctions. So there's a lot of evolution that comes into play. Part of it is basically market operators deciding that storage can participate in these mechanisms. And more recently is Portugal coming into that in their renewable auction. Specifically, kind of a new mechanism in play is that they're allowing solar plus storage to bid into the auction. And it's allowing solar plus storage to bid into its most recent auction based on a flexibility contract. Here you just see different examples of how solar without storage can participate or try to clear the auction based on different contract structures. And then the right hand side is it's specific to solar and storage where they can be paid a base capacity contract, receive wholesale market revenues, which are capped, and also participate or receive ancillary services revenues from the market. So evolution of markets is important and an important aspect of how markets are evolving. And I love the solar and storage story because it helps us understand. It's a kind of an easy way to understand why energy storage can support flexibility needs in markets and help make renewables dispatchable. And because there are great examples in the US, partly because there is a subsidized market here. And what you see here is selected solar plus storage PPAs in the US. So the height of the bubbles represent essentially the PPA prices that we've been seeing in markets in the US for solar plus storage PPAs or solar plus storage projects. The size of the bubble are the sizes of the solar portion of the project. And what you see there is the green bubbles represent projects in Hawaii, so not mainland US. The blue bubbles represent the projects in mainland US. And when you kind of eyeball from looking at this is that Hawaii projects are smaller and mainland US projects are bigger and getting bigger, you also can see kind of this downward trend of PPA prices. Like PPA prices for solar and storage has been coming down over time. Um, and I think this is exciting. We also see them at very low prices, so sub $40 per megawatt hour for energy being delivered, basically dispatchable solar energy being delivered to the grid. And if we were to compare actually this to this chart here, so what you'll see is a change in, a change in the bubble sizes. In this chart here, what you see is actually the bubbles in Hawaii grow. And the reason why they're growing is actually what this chart shows is the size of the batteries in comparison to the solar system. And so in Hawaii, what we actually see is bigger batteries there, which partially explain why the prices there are higher. There's a lot more nuance as to why they're higher, but one of them is because basically the battery is providing more dispatchability compared to the projects that we see in the mainland. So again, we're seeing more projects, more solar and storage PPAs being signed at lower prices, and batteries becoming or playing a bigger role in providing dispatchability to solar projects. And there are multiple types of contracts that we see. I'm not going to spend too long talking about these, but essentially we have seen variations for different types of contracts, generally speaking, of how these are structured across multiple markets in the world. And that helps to kind of explain why storage is an interesting technology to pair with solar, because you can structure contracts in different way to try to basically pull different services or different benefits that storage can provide to the off taker. So example there you see blended PPA, so just a premium price on the solar. If it were a solar only project, a solar PPA plus capacity payments, you're kind of treating the two assets separately, or time varying PPA on the bottom right, where you're probably paying much higher prices for the peak hours of the year when you actually need the firm capacity to be online. And there are multiple companies doing this. Example, this noted there it is a very US-centric chart, US-centric figure, but we do see a lot of utilities, not just in the US, signing different PPAs around these. And so markets are evolving, contract structures are diverse. We probably will see some consolidation on how these contracts are structured. But essentially, because storage is a flexible technology, we'll probably see variations across different markets. And fourth is resiliency has become a driver. What you see here is unfortunately wildfires having affected significantly our places where we live, and especially places in I guess a lot of forests across different places in the world, New South Wales in Australia and Paradise in California, really affecting our landscape and our homes. And this affects the way we plan for our power. So an example here, I guess going back to California, is as a result of wildfires and mitigation of wildfire risks, the utilities have actually been shutting off power to specific locations on the grid when there is higher wildfire risk, in order to reduce any kind of risk associated with power lines. Power lines potentially causing fires in those regions. And over the course of the last 5 or so years, we've seen, I guess in purple there, you see just the outage duration increasing over time to about 53 hours in 2019, and especially the number of customers being impacted by outages increasing over the last I guess 3 or 4 years, to about 1.3 million customers being impacted by outages back in 2019, a trend that's probably going to happen again this year as wildfire seasons come up. And to give some perspective, this is important from the storage perspective, because what we have seen is increasingly a marketing of battery storage systems to homes and to businesses in order to mitigate outages and discomfort related to outages in different markets. So 4 factors, which I've talked about, I'll kind of whiz through kind of the outlook parts of this. On the COVID side, you've heard a lot about this already, so I don't want to spend too long here, but I did want to kind of give perspective on how quickly our perspective has evolved over the past few months and as the pandemic has evolved or has developed. I presented this in April, in April 2020, so in April, just a couple of months ago, trying to make sense of how the battery supply chain in the US is being impacted by COVID-19 or was being impacted by COVID-19. A lot of it was related to manufacturing being disrupted, raw material mining and production being disrupted, transports of goods also being disrupted. And in that perspective, the local supply chain really being reconsidered. I think that there's probably similar talks in Europe as well. So when you are faced with a lot of uncertainty on the global scale, there's a lot of reconsideration that comes with trying to create a more resilient value chain to ensure that you can supply the local markets. And I think the last point is still true regarding demand is key. Because if demand isn't there, you kind of don't really have to worry as much about the supply chain if you don't have anything to supply to. And just to make a few points, the market is still very strong. Our current view on the impact of COVID is, well, behind the meter has had the most disruption globally speaking. Of course, there's different levels to which this is true across different markets. Europe probably has a different impact compared to the US. In the second quarter of this year, just to give an example, in the US, we had seen a lot of like rooftop solar installers who install batteries in the US, announcing that 30 to 50% of their sales had been slashed as a result of people going on lockdown and them not actually being able to install these systems, and due to a lot of uncertainty that was associated with the future of kind of how the economy might look like. There's a lot more clarity now, but the future is still certainly very uncertain. Which means from a perspective of a homeowner or a business, you're still assessing how the economic impact on how the pandemic will impact your home finances to make a decision to make a large purchase.
Right, here's my time cue. We have around a minute left.
Okay. I'm almost there. Thank you. Thank you for the time check. And then the second point is utility scale deployments has not been significantly impacted. So just two examples from Fluence and Gore Street, both stating that their utility scale projects will advance and are slated mostly to be completed on time. So you can kind of advance certain things to make sure that you achieve the certain timelines that you had for a particular contract, for example. And I'll conclude with this slide here just to say the future remains strong for stationary storage. Here you see cumulative installations for storage from 2018 through to 2040. Major markets there is US, China, but you see a lot of European markets, Germany, France, UK as well. So despite near-term disruptions, the fundamentals on what drives energy storage build are still there. And we expect them to kind of continue to be major drivers in accelerating the future of the energy storage industry. And I'll close off with this slide here just to say thank you for having me. This is me and my husband picking blueberries this last weekend. We finally managed to get out of New York City after many months of being locked down. It was quite a relief to know that the green world still exists and it's out there and you can eat really yummy blueberries off it. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot, Yayoi. Awesome. The very first question, of course, that will, I'm sure, pop up in a second is there an option to get the slides? Would you be able to provide a link to download them, or is there a report on Bloomberg?
Yeah, so I should have probably mentioned this in the beginning. So our content is usually for our subscribers, the BNEF subscribers. I have my email there. If you are interested in getting the slides, please do message me. But yeah, I guess just to clarify, typically our reports and a lot of the analysis that we do that backs up all these charts here are available to our clients.
Makes perfect sense. Awesome. Let's dive into the chat questions. So also to all our listeners and viewers out there, please type away your questions in the chat and we'll make sure to include them now in the live Q&A with Yayoi. Let's start with the first question. Of course, first, when you talk about batteries, what is the definition that you work with?
Right, that's a very good question. Should have probably been in the beginning of my presentation. So when we're talking about energy storage in our outlook, we actually intentionally exclude pumped hydro, even though we recognize that pumped hydro is a significant portion of flexibility in different markets. We look at multiple technologies when we talk about energy storage outside pumped hydro. So that includes the worlds of the lithium-ion batteries, which we focus a lot of our time on, but also other technologies as well. So including flow batteries, compressed air, and other technologies. So we do look at other technologies, but probably not at the same length and breadth as we do lithium-ion.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Before we come into other topics, I'll first also have another Bloomberg-specific question. Moritz here is asking that when you often when you say source, the source is Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and he asked whether you could be more specific on your sources.
Right. So a lot of the data and charts that I showed here today is generated by analysis that's done by that 250 people that spread across the world. So a lot of it is curated based on kind of us doing our primary research and then analyzed and done and kind of done analysis for us to be able to kind of tell a story around that. So it's essentially analysis that goes into our reports and into data sets that are available to our clients.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have more questions on that, please do reach out.
So maybe because I know sometimes, depending on the internet connection, people might not be able to read the email address, depending on the resolution. Would you be able to just type it into the chat if you're okay with that? And then people can contact you, or a link that you're comfortable with sharing.
Sure.
So then there is a more specific question. Does Bloomberg study chilled/cool water storage for data centers? In California, there is the duck curve problem on power generation. In some cities, data centers consume more power than in others.
Data centers is a really interesting segment for multiple reasons. Massive load source, technically very flat load, which means when you add sources of flexibility to it, it could be in the form of batteries, it could be in kind of adding kind of generators there. There's a lot of potential. They also have like a lot of the most innovative companies investing in different technologies. So if you think of the Microsoft, the Googles of the world, they are testing out like batteries and different forms of storage into their data centers to kind of understand how they can use their data center as a flexible source of demand. That said, I guess in terms of the total flexible capacity today, it probably isn't as big because there's a lot that needs to be adjusted from a power system perspective for you to really take advantage of that. But I think that is a source of flexible load that will be evolving over time.
Mm-hmm. Then there's a question of Sabine in the chat. Do you think there could be a shortage of lithium-ion cell purchase for stationary storage system manufacturers? That is, if you just scroll up, a shortage of lithium-ion cell purchase for stationary storage system manufacturers, I guess in relation to probably a big demand coming from car manufacturers.
Right. So yeah, I think that's a good question. So how much are basically battery manufacturers just focus on where the market is big? So I think the answer to that question actually changed over time. Currently, I don't think that's a problem from the perspective of it's a very global and diversified market from the perspective of the supply chain. So if there is, for example, if there were shortages from batteries from one specific battery suppliers, you will probably find another battery supplier to replace that particular order. So I think there's diversity enough for shortages not to be a problem. What we might see, and I guess we see that from a pricing perspective, is you're probably not going to see as good pricing deals compared to what you see in the EV industry. So maybe if if battery manufacturers are focused on the supply for the EV industry and are kind of pressed to deliver to that when orders ramp up, the focus becomes less about delivering to stationary storage systems. We definitely saw this in the Korean market, for example. When the Korean markets boomed, there was actually a shortage of supply to the global market, which meant that from the Korean perspective, the LG Chems, the Samsungs, they could actually kind of pick and choose, or they would prefer to pick and choose larger players to supply their batteries to. And so that comes with, obviously with some associated pricing, additional pricing.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me see. I think we'll just go chronologically through the next questions. How big is the risk of cannibalization from demand response and vehicle to grid EVs?
That is a very good question. So there's probably two factors. So I'd say on the demand response side, I would say that actually it's been a bit more of the opposite as of late. So, and obviously demand response, you could use batteries for demand response. But generally the traditional demand response, which is just reducing your load, calling up a factory and telling them to turn down their demand. There's actually been a shift recently more towards energy storage as a source of kind of flexibility compared to demand response. And so we're actually seeing the opposite factor of like, because batteries can do more and can provide like faster response to the grid, that means actually that we get some displacement of demand response, traditional demand response, to provide certain flexibility services. On the question on EVs to the grid, our long-term analysis actually does look at kind of how EVs charge, or at make an assumption on how EVs charge, and considers basically when we're dispatching power to try to meet supply or demand needs for different markets. We consider kind of the demand profile and demand from for power or electricity from EVs. And obviously the more EVs or the more flexible EVs are in charging, the less you would necessarily need other forms of flexibility. So from that perspective, there would be some cannibalization. We haven't quantified that per se, but that's definitely something that kind of we've considered in our long-term analysis.
Thank you. Then there's more question in regards to the numbers and the exact definition. Gunter, to which scope of battery do the prices relate to? And I guess in line with that question from Abdel, battery costs based on what volume quantity? Question mark.
I can probably follow up on that offline. So I think that relates to the chart that shows kind of battery prices by segment and how stationary storage is higher than the EV market. And the annual charts will probably respond to that. So I guess I can follow up offline, but essentially there is way more, like there's like 20 times more volumes that we see in EVs, for example, compared to stationary storage for lithium-ion batteries in particular.
Okay, so if you're interested in more exact numbers, then just use the email address that Yayoi already posted in the chat, and she'll be able to follow up on that offline. Let me check another question by Gunther. What do you think? Can NAS for storage durations bigger than 4 hours compete against lithium ion?
Sorry, soda and sulfur. So actually, like if we were to look at the kind of the technology mix historically, sodium sulfur on a megawatt hour basis ends up being what makes the difference year on year when there is like a non-lithium percentage or a block of capacity that's being added. So from a capacity standpoint, there's actually a lot that's already been commissioned, a lot of that in Japan. But from a cost perspective, I'd have to refresh I'd have to look at the numbers, but as far as I recall, like the challenge is kind of the cost, being challenging to compete against lithium-ion batteries. So and obviously cost plus duration. So you'd have to look at kind of different duration brackets to see how sodium sulfur could compete. Currently, for 4 hours, it probably isn't as competitive. For its max utilization, I think it could be competitive. One of the advantages being, I think, longer lifetime. Um, but anyway, I can probably follow up on that one offline as well.
No problem. Maybe as a closing question, when you talk about disruption of the battery technologies, including production, logistics, etc., so how much will that be influenced by other disruptions when it comes to electric vehicles, solar tech, power electronics? How will that influence the demand and prices of batteries?
Yeah, so when we do our long-term pricing curve, that's basically a top-down approach of saying like, oh, if we were to assume 18% learning rate, this is what prices could look like. We try to validate that by doing the bottom-up analysis. So basically looking at how much materials cost to produce different types of battery chemistries and how much it costs to manufacture batteries, say in China versus the US versus Europe. And obviously there's a difference there because input prices looks different, logistics for materials looks different, and we can validate quite a lot of it based on kind of that bottom up approach. And what we can't, we basically look at the technology, the step changes that are possible within lithium ion to see what is possible. A lot of the innovation is a function of kind of on the lithium ion front is a function of innovation resulting from EV and EV investments. So making energy density higher, making manufacturing processes more efficient. So there's like multiple components of what that looks like, and that could probably be its own presentation. So I'm happy to kind of follow up as well if you're interested in that.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we are already going a little bit over time, but I think people really want to make the use of the keynote slot here. So I'll include one more question coming from Rizwan. How do you see the role of Second Life EV for ESS applications?
Yeah, we looked at that a couple of years ago. It's something that I know the team will be revising a view over the coming months. So I guess the logic is since there is so much more batteries in EVs, eventually they have to come out and they could be used potentially for second use applications in stationary. I think there is some potential there. I think one of the challenges is related to how much prices for new batteries are falling as a result, and how much you can repackage those used batteries into a cost competitive, but also a product that developers and installers want to use, because there's a risk associated with that. So if you could streamline and make repackaging of used batteries cheap enough, then there could be a market. But so far, our view has been the kind of the cost of new batteries are falling, and it's probably more attractive to use.
Do you think then that's something that will be steered through regulation? I guess in the EU there will be a big focus on circular economy. So you think that will, rather than being driven by the price, it will be driven by regulations, the second life use?
Yeah, so I think recycling happens regardless. I guess the difference is when it happens. If you think of the role of second life batteries. So regulation will definitely and has moved the requirements or necessity for recycling. It also pushes companies or helps support companies to invest in recycling technologies. So I think regulation does have a very important role in that sense. I think also companies are willing to innovate, kind of not regardless, but they are interested in looking for methods of recycling just from the perspective of, can I extract materials that I can reuse for new batteries or potentially sell for other applications? And obviously, different car companies and battery manufacturers have different kind of attitudes towards that. Tesla is more on the kind of recycling route. Other car companies historically have looked at the repurposing kind of routes. So I think there's a lot of potential either way, but recycling seems to just be the baseline of what is required for a future clean system.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. I think with regards to the time, I have to wrap it up here so people still have the chance to take a 10-minute break before we come to our last session. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Yayoi. If you're ready, yes, as mentioned, she shared her email address in the chat. If you want to follow up, get in touch, or get access to a more in-depth numbers by Bloomberg, please contact her, and I'm sure she'll be quick in the response.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for joining us. Yayoi.